I'm going to share my screen again. So we have for our featured speaker this evening is Rachel King. She hails from South Carolina, where her desire to protect birds may have all started with the chickens her family raised. As a child, Rachel hand-raised all of their chickens, and she kept them in her bedroom until they were old enough to live outside. And it appears that they even bonded with her, because even as adult, the chickens that is, they would follow her around and even sit in her lap. So Rachel may be a chicken whisperer, I don't know. Her family then moved to Orlando, Florida when she was a teenager, and she went to the University of Central Florida, where she received a BS in biology. She then received an MS in ecology at the University of Georgia, where she studied spatial ecology and overland movements of aquatic turtles. I'd like to know more about their overland movement. She then worked as a regional biologist for FWC, where she conducted bird surveys for a number of bird species. And she is currently with Ecological Associates Incorporated, where she continues to work with birds, particularly the endemic and endangered Florida scrub jay, our only real endemic bird, and the threatened crested caracara, which it just so happens is the subject of Rachel's presentation this evening. And so without further ado, I give you Rachel King. You can all plot in front of your computer screens. She can't hear you, but so Rachel King.
All right. Hi, everybody. All right. So I think everybody should be able to see this. So thank you for that introduction. And yes, I love all birds, but chickens have a special place in my heart. And I wish I lived in an area that wasn't the suburbs right now so that I could have chickens again. So hopefully one day. But yes, I love my chickens. So I do work with crested caracaras and scrub jays. In fact, I'm going to be doing some scrub jay surveys next week for a client, so I'm very excited. But tonight we're going to talk about crested caracaras in Florida, and their scientific name is the Caracara sharaway. And this is probably one of my only good photos that I've ever taken of one, and it was with borrowing my boss's nice camera. So a lot of the nice photos in this presentation are from someone else, and I tried to give them credit. Most of the far off ones are going to be mine, so I apologize. And I will also try to go slow. Usually I do these presentations in person, so hopefully I won't talk too fast. So we have a lot to talk about tonight, and so I wanted to break it down into an outline and to try and break it down into manageable sections. First, we're going to talk about the description of the caracara as well as its distribution in the United States and in Florida, the general life history of the caracara as well as threats to the population, their legal status and recommended management practices by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, how to conduct nest surveys, and also how to conduct long-term monitoring for the crested caracara. The first time I saw one of these caracaras, I was horseback riding in East Orange County, and I saw one walking on the ground, and I did not know what it was, and I said that cannot be a native species. They just look so funky and so tropical. And I spoke to a park ranger, and he said, well, it is native, but this is the northern extent of its range. So it is oftentimes from in tropical areas, but this is native to Florida. So this is what they look like. They are a fairly large bird. They can be about 2 feet long with these very distinctive long yellow legs, and those have an advantage that I'll talk about in a bit, as well as this yellowish orange bald face. Very distinctive. I don't know if we have any other birds like that around here, but you guys can correct me later if I'm wrong about that. They do have a white head and throat with some barring on the chest and shoulders, and a dark body, usually brownish to black. And they do also have some barring, you can't see in this picture, but they have some barring on their tails as well, on the backside. And they have this very distinctive black crest, which I usually nickname their toupee. And they can lift it in the back when they are agitated. So that's where they get the crested caracara from. So the adult is what we've been seeing pictures of so far, and the adult plumage is very distinctive with that very dark and very white body and the very distinctive yellow and orange face and legs. The juveniles are actually going to be about the same size as the adults once they fledge, but they are going to have a fairly different pattern. They're going to be more tan and tannish brown, and they aren't going to have those distinctive margins between the dark and the white on their body. The big thing too, when we're looking for these in surveys, is the legs and the face too, because the juveniles will always have more of a washed out, pale coloration in their face and legs, whereas the adults are going to be more brightly colored. And these juveniles will keep this plumage for 3 to 4 years. So it's not just the first year out of the nest that they'll have this. They reach sexual maturity closer to 3 to 4 years. When they're flying, they look a lot like the turkey vulture because they have the white wing tips. However, they also have the white neck and tail. And oftentimes they're flying low enough that you can see their face and legs and you can tell the difference. I'm going to show a little video of one flying close to the ground. Hopefully it works. Let's find out. So this was a Caracara with some nesting material, and you can see they fly usually fairly low to the ground. This is extremely low because he doesn't really want to move. But even when they're flying fairly high, they're not going anywhere near as high up as vultures and other raptors. I mean, they go a little higher than that, but not very high. And they don't soar very often. They're not gliding. They have these powerful regular wing beats that they're doing. And so once you've seen them in flight, you can tell they're different from a lot of the other raptors. They're pretty silent. They're not very loud for the most part, but they do have a call that they will do. And I don't know if it's going to show up on this, so I pulled it up on my phone, and I'll just put my phone up to the speaker. But the adults will have a low rattling call that they'll make oftentimes when they are when they're agitated. Actually, the only time I've heard one of them make a sound is when I came up on a nest that we didn't know was there. And I heard the call and I said, that's Caracara. And I looked up and about 100 feet away, one was glaring at me from a nest. So they don't make the call very often, but here's one. Hopefully you guys can hear it, but if not, the Audubon website has some great sound clips as well as the Macaulay Bird Library. I don't know if you guys were able to hear that, so I'm sorry. And the young juveniles, when they're in a nest, they do have a different sort of call that they'll make, and it sounds a lot more like an osprey. So let me see if this one will show up. Okay, now I've got to turn it off. So very different calls, but like I said, usually once they've left the nest, they're not going to make those calls anymore. It's usually just the low rattling call. Oh, sorry. Okay, so now we're going to talk about where they're distributed. They do occur primarily in Central and South America, and they're actually not the only species of Caracara. There are quite a few different species, but they're all this one is the only species that occurs in the United States. But as you can see, based on this map, most of their range is in Central and South America. The only areas of the US where they can be found are Texas, Arizona, and Florida. And it's believed that they used to be a lot more widespread across the United States. However, during the last ice age, the Florida population became isolated, and so they're their own distinct population now. They're a non-migratory bird in Florida, so they're not mixing with the other populations. Within Florida, you can find them in most of the southern and central peninsula for a little further inland, because they historically inhabited these dry prairies that were found throughout South and Central Florida. Historically, over the past about 100 to 150 years, a lot of these prairies have been converted to different types of agriculture, including cattle ranching, sod farms, and even citrus groves. And then some of them have also been developed into residential areas. Thankfully, the Caracara also does well in a few other habitats, including the ones that used to be this and were converted. So they do like cattle pastures quite a bit. And there's a reason for that. For one, it's wide and open. There are oftentimes scattered trees that they can roost in. And if there's a dead cow, they'll eat the dead cow. So they love that part. Another great perk of a lot of these cattle pastures is they have these canals that are man-made canals that are cut through the property, and they like to use those for foraging. So here's a picture of two of them that I took one morning survey, an early morning survey, of two juveniles hanging out next to a canal near my survey station. They, like I said, they like these big open areas with this low vegetation and these scattered trees. And I'll talk about this later, but the cabbage palm is one of the key parts of their habitat. And so if you see a big wide open area in Florida, especially in the panhandle with scattered cabbage palms, it's probably suitable Caracara habitat. Interestingly enough, the juveniles like to spend a lot of time in citrus groves. So we think they like to forage there, and because they're not breeding, they're not using any nest trees in the area. So this was a site in Hendry County where we were doing some surveys, and we were being followed by some juveniles. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it based on this screen size from Zoom, but there were two juvenile caracaras that were following us around all day. And they're perched in these orange trees. And then one of them eventually flew down to the ground, and we were able to take a picture of it close up. So now we'll talk a little bit about their basic life history, which includes, general behaviors, breeding, nesting, just general reproduction. And to start off, they are a diurnal species. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, that means they are more active in the daytime. So owls are nocturnal, caracaras are more diurnal. And they often forage on the ground, which is why they have those nice long legs, because it can help them run after prey that's on the ground. They are opportunistic, but they will eat quite a bit of different species and a variety of prey, including rodents, lizards, snakes. I've seen them eating turtle eggs. They will eat cows, dead cows, and other carrion. And so they're often associated with vultures, and a lot of people think they are vultures, but they're actually part of the falcon family. But they will follow vultures to carrion oftentimes, and they'll usually fight with the vultures over food. But most people, when they see a caracara, it's on the roadside because they're attracted to the roadkill. They're gregarious, and they like to hang out together. They oftentimes like to roost together during the non-nesting season. The juveniles in particular spend a lot of their first year together. And again, this is one of my bad field pictures through a spotting scope of a tree snag that had, I think it had at one point over 5 juveniles hanging out in it. And the juveniles have also been found to congregate in mass in a few different floodplain areas along the Kissimmee River Basin north of Lake Okeechobee. So the juveniles spend quite a bit of time together. And then after their first year, they start dispersing to try and find their own nesting territories. They have a very distinctive courtship display in which they'll throw their head back and oftentimes make their calls to each other. And they are monogamous, so once they find a mate, they're usually going to stay with that mate for life. And they are also fairly long-lived. I think a lot of ones that have been in captivity have lived to be past 30 years old. So in the wild, they're probably living, you know, at least 10, 20 years, and they're trying to breed every year. The adults do become territorial during the nesting season. They will sometimes allow juveniles to stay near the edges and forage in the outer edges of their territory, but they will not let any birds near their nest trees once the breeding season starts. They primarily nest in these cabbage palms, which are why these cabbage palms are so important. They will roost and perch in other types of trees, but they almost always like to nest in the cabbage palms. Other trees that they have been known to nest in every now and then have been oak trees, pine trees, cypress trees. And there have been a few cases, and there was a paper done on this, of some that were discovered in Clewiston nesting in a few different man-made structures, including an electrical tower and a billboard. So this is very interesting, and they ended up writing a paper about that. So there have been a couple of instances of them nesting in man-made structures in Florida. So both parents will build a nest and take care of the young. I've seen both of them flying in and out of the nest. They have high nest site fidelity, so they'll try and go back to that site every year. And they'll try and go back to the same tree typically as well. So they nest a lot like bald eagles do. They'll find a tree that they like, they'll build a nest, and every year come back to it or to a tree nearby, one of their backup trees. And sometimes, you know, the nest will get blown out throughout the year, but they'll usually just rebuild the nest in that tree again. They have fairly large home ranges too. During the breeding season, they have these home ranges of about 3,000 acres. And so one breeding pair can take up quite a bit of space. And there's actually been a recent study that is suggesting that a lot of the juveniles are having a hard time finding new territory because it's pretty saturated. Pretty much anywhere that does have the suitable nesting and foraging habitat is taken by a breeding pair. So when you see these juveniles outside of the normal range, it's probably because they're trying to find a place that would have suitable habitat for them. So the nesting season is typically from November to April. They have been found nesting as early as September and as late as June. However, the typical nesting season is November to April, and the peak egg-laying season is actually going to be late December to early February. And this egg-laying is often coinciding with the drop in precipitation in the fall. They typically lay 2 to 3 eggs, and incubation lasts about 32 days, and then they hatch out looking like these little Muppets with wigs. Super cute. And this is a picture taken by Joan Morrison, who is one of the premier researchers on Caracaras in Florida. The juveniles will fledge about 43 to 56 days after hatching. And by then, they'll be about as big as the adult, and they will stay with the adult for a couple of months, maybe 2 to 3 months, before going to hang out with the other juveniles. There are quite a few threats to caracaras, much like all the different species of birds in the Florida. Habitat loss and degradation is the big one. Of course, a lot of the areas they like to and they need to inhabit for their breeding and foraging are being developed very rapidly, whether it be for citrus groves or developed land for residential areas and urban areas. And you can see on this picture over here, this is the projected land use in 2060 of development for residential and urban. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of that orange development going right into a lot of their territory. And this, I don't think even counts, takes into account climate change, which will also probably have a very large impact on a lot of their territory and their habitat. You oftentimes see the caracaras next to the roads, and it's because they like to have access to that carrion and the roadkill. However, with increased roads and usually highways in Florida with very fast traffic, you're going to have increased mortalities as well as the caracaras. Historically, and well, hopefully nobody's doing this now, they were being trapped and killed illegally or as bycatch for other predators like raccoons and nuisance type animals. And they were also being poisoned. And a lot of this was because cattle ranchers were afraid that they would eat the calves, newborn calves. So they were shooting them and killing them. Another issue is disease. As we know, a lot of birds can give diseases to other bird species. And so that's definitely something to worry about. The Florida population of the crested caracara is vulnerable because it is an isolated small population. So there are so many different things that could really devastate the population and cause a collapse, including an ill-timed hurricane hitting at the peak nesting season, or a disease outbreak, or even if suddenly more males are born than females, that can really skew the population dynamics and cause a collapse. So because they have all these threats, they are protected. They're protected federally and also in the state of Florida. They're listed as threatened on both levels. And their nests and nest trees are protected year-round. So that's very important. Like I said earlier, these nests are usually used every single year by a breeding pair. So even when it's not breeding season, these nest trees need to be protected because they will be used again. They're protected by 2 different zones, including the primary zone, which is going to be 985 feet from around the nest tree, so a nice 300-meter buffer. And that's going to be mainly for protecting the actual nest tree during nesting season from disturbance. These are very shy during the nesting season. They're very secretive about where they put their nests, and they do not like being disturbed when they're nesting. So this primary zone is to protect them from disturbance during the nesting time. They also have a secondary protection zone, which is going to be about 1.5 kilometers radius around the nest tree, so about close to 5,000 feet. And this is primarily going to be the foraging area. So they're having to forage more during breeding season, and so they need to have that habitat around that nest tree to be able to forage successfully in. And so one of the things, especially during breeding season, that needs to be protected is the foraging area. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife has recommended some different management practices. So there are a few different things. Oftentimes, if you are a land manager for a government agency and you have caracara habitat and you want to manage it, or if you're a private landowner and you're trying to either attract caracaras or keep them on, or doing development, and you need to mitigate and try to not have an impact on caracaras, then there are a few different things you can do. During the non-nesting season, you can, of course, maintain the nest tree and other trees around for perching and roosting. The nest tree shouldn't be, can't be destroyed anyways, but a lot of people would want to clear other trees out of the area that the adults like to use for perching. I said earlier that they like a lot of low ground vegetation for foraging, so this is a good good foraging for them because they do like to forage a lot on the ground. So some good ways of maintaining this type of vegetation during the non-nesting season include mowing and cattle grazing, as well as prescribed burns. Also avoiding the use of toxic chemicals, particularly herbicides, pesticides, even fertilizers, because they do forage so much on the ground. And also planting cabbage palm trees in clusters for them. If there are areas that might be suitable forage areas, but don't have these trees, then the Caracara might not want to breed in that area. So you can actually make it more suitable for them for nesting by planting cabbage palms in clusters.
They look like really tall, skinny trunks.
During nesting season, you have to limit your agricultural and human activities within the primary zone until the young fledge. So that's that primary zone that's, you know, close to 1,000 feet around the nest tree. Basically, just don't do any work in those areas. You can do management activities during the nesting season in the secondary zone. They like to forage, and they have to forage in the secondary zone during the nesting season, and so maintaining that low vegetation even during the nesting season will benefit them. So now we're going to talk about surveys. This is a lot of what I do for my job, is I get asked to conduct surveys on certain properties for nests, and they can be very difficult to find. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife has created a crested caracara nest survey protocol. And it can be used for many different reasons. It can be used for, you know, conducting research on nests. It can be land managers needing to find nests for management activities, developers trying to see if they, you know, would have any impacts if they bought a property that has caracaras on it or suspected caracaras. And it's also used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife for consultations. So I just picked this property on Google Earth as an example. I have no idea whose property this is, but it looked really nice for caracaras on aerial. It's about 240 acres, and this is basically, the next few slides are going to show how I set up a survey. We have the survey, and we need to survey within the red lines for caracara nest trees. However, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also has a 1,500-meter buffer around the property that needs to be surveyed as well, or at least investigated, because their secondary zone is 1,500 meters. If there's a nest tree on the edge of the property, they'll be using that secondary that's not necessarily on the property. So you need to look for that as well. What I would do with this property is, since it's nice and open, I would split it into 4 different stations, and each station would be placed so that you can see all land in between your station and the station beside you, as well as off-site, off the property as much as possible. And what we would do is then we would also send this to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife for approval prior to starting a survey. Peak nesting season, or peak egg season, is around late December to early February. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife requires that surveys start no later than January 10th, and that they take place every 2 weeks at least until the end of April. So this is to maximize your chances of finding a nest, because they are so hard to find. Oftentimes you're going to need multiple sessions out there to find a nest. And you need to have at least 3-hour-long surveys, and they need to start at least 15 minutes prior to sunrise. So during the nesting season, the caracara, the adults, will be most active in the early morning, foraging and feeding the young. So that's when you would be seeing them flying to and from the nest tree. And you want to begin 15 minutes prior to sunrise so that you're not bothering them when you're setting up your station area, because they usually aren't going to start waking up and moving around till around sunrise. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife also requires that each station have at least one experienced surveyor. And these experienced surveyors, they have to meet qualifications in that they have to have birding experience in general, but then they also need to have at least 40 hours of caracara nesting survey experience. That's how hard it can be to find these nests. One time I was standing under a nest tree that we knew was a nest tree, and it was after the fledgling had left for the year. And we were looking up in the tree and we still couldn't see the nest. It's so well camouflaged. So they're very hard to find. And so they want people who are very familiar with Caracara behaviors at each station. So for this type of survey, we would have 4 people on site at a time. So it can be quite a time consuming and a lot of manpower for these surveys. So there are a few different ways to do these surveys. The preferred method for us has been to do it from the truck. And that is nice to do because the Caracaras aren't usually afraid of vehicles and you're staying still. The issue, well, another benefit is usually we're doing these in cattle pastures, and cows can be very, very curious. And so it's kind of nice to be in the car when they're mobbing your truck. And there have been a few times where I've had to chase the babies away because they were chewing on the bumpers. So it can be pretty exciting out there. And another exciting thing about doing these surveys is we're having to get out there so early. You have to make sure you don't accidentally run into any of the ditches and canals that are on the property because you're getting out there. Oh man, it's dark out there when you're setting up. There's another way of doing it. You can also be in a hunting blind. However, you are going to be more at the mercy of the wildlife, AKA the horses and cows. In this case, this horse ended up tearing down the hunting blind and we had to go rescue my friend who was at that station. So it can be exciting sometimes. But this blind, this photo on the right kind of shows the general setup. We'll have all of the different windows open so that we can look in all directions around our blinds. We're going to have our bird spotting scopes and binoculars for looking for birds. We'll have data sheets that we'll be filling out, as well as radios and cell phones so that we can contact each other. And that's actually very important because oftentimes these birds are flying between stations and you want to let the person at the station next to you know that, hey, you've got a bird coming in, because they might be looking in another direction. And we're trying to do in these surveys is find out where these birds are coming and going. So we need to know all of this information. The most important thing that we bring out is our coffee, because we're usually getting up around 4 a.m. to do these, and I'm not a morning person. And it's usually in the winter, which winter in Florida, I know, but it can get down in the 30s while we're out there. So a nice cup of hot coffee, or a lot more than a cup of hot coffee, is a must when you're doing these. So these are the data sheets that we end up filling out while we're in the field. Of course, we type them up later so they're legible, but this is the data sheet that is given to surveyors by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife to fill out. It's going to have your station information, your date and time. You have to take a fair amount of weather data because you don't want to do these surveys when it's super foggy or rainy or very windy, because it's going to affect your surveying. So you'll take some weather observations. You want to look and see what your habitat conditions are at your station, because if there's something happens and they're no longer suitable, you might need to move your station. And of course, we will take observations of the actual Caracaras that we see. We need to break them down by age and when we saw them. So we'll put either adult or immature, or sometimes if they're really far away, then we don't know. And their description of their behavior. So we look at their flight paths and whether they're perching, whether they're foraging, if we think that they're nest building or going to a nest tree. We want to get all of that information down. And we actually use this information to create flight path maps that go on our reports to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So we like to be fairly descriptive. And there have been times where we had so many Caracara on the property that we were filling out it, like each station was filling out 10 pages of this. And we were wondering if we should start just recording our voices to dictate later. And then of course, other times you get nothing. You get maybe some meadowlarks and you don't get any Caracaras that day. But this is what we fill out. We're not only filling out Caracara observations, we're also filling out observations of raptors, other raptors, including bald eagles, hawks, and even crows. And we will also look at vultures. And that sounds kind of weird, but one thing that actually gives away a nest really well is a turkey vulture, because for some reason, caracaras do not like turkey vultures near their nests. They don't seem to care about black vultures so much. But we have found a nest before because a turkey vulture came flying in and both the adults chased it off, and that's when we found the nest. So that's another interesting thing that you need to write down, is how other birds that might affect caracara behavior are acting during these surveys. So let's say we found a nest. In this case, the nest was in there. And we want to see basically if it's productive. So we have what we call productivity surveys that we do. And so we would stop doing our typical nest searching surveys and we would do these, which is going to be fairly similar, except that you know where the nest is and you're going to be spending a lot of time watching the movements in the nest and the comings and goings of the adults. And the goal of it is to find out if the nest is successful that year. So hopefully you'll be able to eventually see, you know, fledglings coming out of the nest. But sometimes the nest fails and you'll be able to tell that, and you'll report that to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. In the case of this nest, it was successful the year that I was doing this particular survey. I was kind of panicking because I hadn't seen anybody in the nest that day coming and going, and I was afraid that the nest had failed. And then I looked across the field and the adults were hanging out in one dead oak tree and the juvenile was hanging out in another dead oak tree. So it was a success that year. So that was very exciting. So what happens if you know where a nest is and you want to keep monitoring for it? Usually, once you've found a nest, you know that's going to be the general nesting area because they have such high site fidelity. So we like to do this long-term monitoring of known nest territories for a few different reasons, including determining if the territory remains occupied over the years, if it's the same breeding pair that's using the territory year after year, how many young are fledging each year, so how successful is that breeding pair. We also want to look at monitor the habitat use and any changes to the habitats. And I feel like that one's very important with the rapid development of Florida. You want to make sure that these sites will remain suitable for the caracaras. And so this habitat use monitoring is associated with habitat conservation. So if you have agency lands, you want to make sure that your management strategy is working for Caracara. You need to do some of this long-term monitoring to make sure that they're doing well. It's also associated with land development projects. There are some projects where they have unavoidable impacts to caracaras, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife requires this long-term monitoring to see if the caracaras are going to stay or if they're going to end up leaving because of the land development. And because these birds are so loyal to their sites, it can take them years to decide to leave their nest area and their nest territory and find a new territory. So these surveys should occur at least monthly for about 3 years. So it can be quite extensive. And you need to be doing these surveys a minimum of 4 hours per survey period. The actual survey setup can be very similar to the nesting survey, except you already know which tree to go to. And if you see birds, instead of just watching them, oftentimes you're following them to see what habitats they're using. And there have been a few projects where instead of just following the birds manually, they will radio track them using some GPS backpacks. It's not very common because permits are required, federal permits, and I think there's only one permit holder in the state of Florida for Caracaras, and that's Joan Morrison. But I have known some friends who have gotten to work with her on some of these, and they're pretty interesting because you can get the data continuously. You don't need to be out there to get the data, and you can get a lot more data points. So I haven't gotten to do any of that part yet, but I would love to work with Joan and put some backpacks on some Caracaras. So I know this was a lot of information, and I'm sure you guys have some questions, and I hope I didn't go too fast. But let me know if you have any questions. You know, I can answer them to the best of my ability.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. That was so informative, wonderful. Yes, there are a bunch of questions. And let me start. Just let me first say that earlier you mentioned the Macaulay Library when you referred to the sound recording. Well, Linda Macaulay, who is along with her husband, founded the Macaulay Library. She was on this, she was one of the participants on this presentation earlier. She's no longer here now, I've noticed, but she was here earlier with us. So yes, Linda Macaulay of the world famous Macaulay Library at Cornell University, the most outstanding natural history resource library for both sound recordings, audio and visual recordings of animals, was part of this meeting today. Anyway, questions. So what's that yellow ball on the bird's chest in the first image? This is asked by Fred Kwan and Ann Wiley.
I forgot to mention it. So that is actually their gullet. When they have been well fed, their gullets will poke out, and it's pretty funny to see. And everybody always wonders what it is. So that just means they've been well fed that day.
Oh, and Chris Goley had noticed that on the chicks' bellies there was a pink spot.
It's their gullet. So those were well fed chicks.
So on the adults, is their gullet pink when it's not well fed? Is it a different color, or
just tucked under the feathers? With these adults, I think their skin in general is more of a yellowish orange color. So when they're poking out, they're the same color as their face and legs. And when they're babies, they have more pinkish skin. So I think that's it, because you'll see a lot of Caracaras that don't have those poking out. It just means they haven't gorged themselves.
They're hungry. Okay. So there's a question. So continuing our discussion of food, do they prefer live food or to roadkill or not?
Good
This is from Kristen Murtaugh.
That is a very good question. I don't actually know. They're very opportunistic, but every time I'm doing the surveys for them, I'm not near a roadside, so I'm seeing them catching things or finding a dead thing in the field that they like. I've seen the juveniles fighting over a dead mouse before, so I'm not sure. I know they are very good hunters. They're great at chasing down food, but I think if there's something already dead, I think they're gonna go for it.
Okay, so they're opportunists.
They're definitely opportunistic.
Is there a risk of them eating? So that you mentioned about them on the concern of farmers and that they were being shot. So is there actually a risk of them eating newborn calves or chickens at farms?
I wouldn't worry about newborn calves. I would worry, there have been a few instances where, they might chase the calf, but I don't think they've ever been documented to eat them in Florida. I think there's another species in South America that has been documented eating at least like the umbilical cord or something. Chickens, these might prey on chickens. I'm not sure. I usually see them associated with cattle, and in a big cattle farm, there's usually a dead cow somewhere, and they just go crazy for that. You'll see like 20 of them on that cow if it's dead.
Wow.
Yeah.
That must be quite a sight.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
So a question from Jeannie Mauser. You talked about surveys. Are drones used for surveys?
No, because U.S. Fish and Wildlife does not want any human disturbance near these nests during this time, and that includes aerial flyovers, and which includes drones, but even crop dusting planes, and agricultural low-flying planes.
Okay.
Those will disturb the Caracara. So what we're doing is we're going in before they wake up to get relatively close to where, we think their tree might be. But I mean, I say that we're still at least probably 500, 600 feet away. And we're getting in there and we're stopping, or we're setting up a blind so that they don't really notice us once they wake up.
Huh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So more questions. Are there incentives for landowners to maintain or create Caracara habitat? Since territories are so large and habitat is so limited, what would it take for more land protection, do you think?
That's a good question. I don't know of any programs that encourage it. It would be great for, even just the state to have something like that. I know that the state has some landowner programs with wildlife in mind, but I don't think there's anything in specific to the Caracara. There are a lot of umbrella species, per se, that might also help the Caracara, such as possibly the burrowing owl or the gopher tortoise, because they like wide open areas too. But I don't think there's anything for Caracaras. I'm trying to think. What I would recommend is definitely more incentives for preserving this land, because most of them are found on private property. There's actually, I think, only one federal property in Florida where they're found, and I think that's Avon Park Air Force Base.
Oh.
And most of where else they are found are either state lands, but mainly private lands. I'm trying to think. A lot of the private lands they're on are cattle pastures, so I would think incentives to cattle farmers might be something, because oftentimes they end up selling their property because they can't afford it anymore. But yeah, that's a complicated question.
So speaking of them being on cattle farms, does that make it difficult for you to survey them because so many are on private property?
It can be very difficult, yes. So luckily, in my case, most of the properties I've been on, we already had landowner permission from our clients. And it was more when we were trying to go off the property to survey in that buffer. There were too many landowners and too many of them were saying, no, stay off my property. But usually when we're going to do our surveys on a particular property, we already have permission for that part.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know if the same bird is returning? The questioner, Ann Wiley, says, I don't see any banded.
They do have bands, some of them. In fact, it's encouraged to report the bands if you do see them. There aren't too many that are banded anymore. Usually, especially with the juveniles, we have no idea, because sometimes we'll have 15 juveniles hanging out in an area, and we call it the frat house. And they're all coming and going so fast, you can't tell which one's which. And we would name them, but we had no idea which one was which. But when it comes to the breeding adults, there's only going to be two that you're watching, because it's a breeding pair with a large territory. And of course, you never know which one's the male or the female, because they are not sexually dimorphic. They do look the same. But you'll know it's the same ones if they're going back and forth to the tree.
Our own bird expert, Clive Pinnock, asks, what are the reactions to the presence of bald eagles in the area?
Oh man, I have a great story of a pair of juvenile Caracara who were harassing a bald eagle, because this was a unique site where there was a Caracara nest tree on the site and a bald eagle nest tree. They were on opposite sides of the property, but there were some juveniles hanging out. They were loitering, I called it, near the bald eagle tree. The bald eagle came in with a snake, and they chased the bald eagle and kept trying to steal the snake from him. And so that was quite interesting to see. The bald eagles, I think, just think of them as super annoying. Yeah, but they're pretty funny. They're pretty fun to watch.
Great. So another question going back to, I guess, their, in terms of their condition, are rodenticides a problem for them?
I would think so. Luckily, in a lot of these rural areas, people aren't, you know, putting out too many, you know, rodenticides unless there's, you know, grain or something like that. But I would think poisoning, as you know, bycatch poisoning types of things have definitely happened with Caracara. Whether it's malicious or accidental, it's definitely happened.
And this, I guess, concerns your specific when you do surveys. When you conduct a survey, is it done for the land developers or to create conservation easements or both, or are there other reasons why you're doing surveys?
So we do all of them. Most of the time we have a client, oftentimes they're trying to decide if they want to buy a property because there's a client that I work with a lot that likes to buy up land that doesn't have very much ecological value. So there aren't, you know, very many, if any, listed species or important habitats on them. So one thing we'll do is, if it looks suitable, we will do a survey. And if there are no Caracara nests on the site and other things, they might end up buying the property to develop it. If there are Caracaras, oftentimes those nest protection areas are so wide that they say, no, we're not going to buy the property.
So at least for the Caracara, it's better if they're there because they get their territory.
For this client, yes.
Kay Gates asks, so please say again the best place, season, time in Florida to view Caracaras.
Well, you're going to be seeing them on roadsides year round because they don't migrate. The best time to see nesting is going to be probably, I would say, late November to March, you know, anywhere around that time.
And if you would give us the best clue possible to finding that nest, which you say are very difficult to find.
You know, going to the area you're interested in looking at cabbage palms and looking to see if you see any adult Caracaras around in general, because, you know, the juveniles might be hanging out, but they're not paired off yet. If you see adults paired off during the breeding season, they probably have a nest somewhere. And it would be, oftentimes it's a matter of keeping an eye on them. And that's why we make those flight maps, so that we can sometimes, you know, we get back from the field and we look at our flight maps and we go, oh, it looks like they're spending a lot of time over in this corner. Maybe we should move one of our stations a little closer there.
Right.
But it's really hard to do in one go. That's why we usually do 3 to 4 month long surveys.
So we shouldn't be too disappointed if we're hoping to see a Caracara nest and we never see one.
Yeah, I mean, because even when I find a nest, I'm not approaching it almost ever, and you know, because you don't want to disturb the birds. So the only person I know of who really gets close to the nest would be Joan Morrison, because she's researching them.
I see. Do they leave, Deborah Smith asked, do they leave vomit balls similar to owls?
I have not seen that. I have been under one of their nests right after the fledgling had fledged for the year, and I didn't see anything. I didn't even see poop. It was so clean. That's what, they're so secretive. They're so hard to find.
And another question, or actually, who got the snake? I guess there's...
I think in that case, the bald eagle kept it. I think yes, it was because the other bald eagle came to help. So they were nesting too, and one of the bald eagles was fighting with the Caracaras. The other bald eagle came in and they chased him off. Yeah.
So Jay Richard, who is currently up in just north of Boston, I think, he mentions a juvenile crested Caracara visited a farm in Amesbury, Massachusetts, where I think he is, with black vultures, and this is near the New Hampshire border.
There have been instances of Caracaras in some very interesting parts of the U.S., very far from their natural range. And the juveniles will they'll move around. There have been sightings in California, in the Midwest, in, you know, the Massachusetts, New York area. And yeah, that may have just been a very confused juvenile. He was hanging with the wrong crowd. I don't know.
Well,
But they do disperse more. Just like, you know, a lot of birds do. They'll disperse and then they find out, well, maybe this isn't the right place for me.
well, I'm sure it excited the Massachusetts birders up
I
there.
think I
They
heard
go
of
out
that
in
one.
droves to see it.
Yeah.
So at what age, Clive asks another question, do they start breeding?
Usually about 4 years of age. So 3 to 4 years of age.
Okay.
So they actually spend quite a bit of time congregating in their little frat houses with their other juvenile friends. They spend a few years doing that.
That's funny. I love the term frat house.
We come up with fun terms for them in the field because we're like, well, that's like the frat house over there. They're all going crazy, and then the adults will end up chasing them off the field. It's great.
That's great. So we have no other questions. And I just wanted to thank you for that wonderful presentation. I know I learned a great deal about crested caracaras, and I'm sure so did many of our other viewers out there today. And we hope we can have you back sometime again. Maybe you could talk about, I know you also do Florida scrub jays as well.
Yes, I love doing the scrub jay talks too. So
that would be so exciting. Thank you again so much for joining us today.
yeah, thank you for inviting me. And thanks, everybody.
I'm just going to close today's presentation. So we'll be seeing you again. I wanted to remind you next month on Tuesday, November 10, not the first Tuesday, that's election day, but the second Tuesday, and it'll be at 7 p.m. And since our social 15 minutes went so well today, I think we'll repeat it again, and we'll sign on, or you can sign on early and chat. And so we'll start at 6:45. Our presenter next month is Melissa Meinitz, who is an author and blogger, and she'll be talking about being your own birder. So she'll be talking about birding in your own unique way. And I think for all of us who do go birding and who enjoy seeing birds, I think that'll be a really wonderful presentation to see what she has to say. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was wonderful having you all in my house and being in your homes as well this evening. And we hope to see you again next month and go out and see some great birds because it's still migration. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.
How you get on there without having to be on there.
Thank you.
Now we're seeing all the other people.
Thank you.
Just leave.
The only one blacked out.